Hey nerds, what's up? Today I want to talk about gender swapping in fantasy media. Honestly, this is one of those subjects where my mind isn't really made up, and I really want to explore with you guys kind of how we feel, particularly our usual knee-jerk reaction when we find out about gender swapping of some of our fantasy characters. What is usually the purpose of these gender swaps? Is it successful? And ultimately ask the question, when it comes to our favorite fantasy characters, does gender matter, or how much does it matter? As a reminder, I know this can be a very sensitive topic, so I ask that you are very civil in the comments, respect others, respect me. Let's have a civil conversation about this. See you after the gem. Now, the first reason I think many of us have a knee-jerk negative reaction to gender swapping generally is proportional to how close we are to the original property that is being changed. Now, this is true of any changes in an adaptation, as I talked about in my adaptation video. The closer we are to a property, the more we have certain expectations about how those things are supposed to play out. And with a character, gender is no exception to that. A good example for me personally is the series Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. Now, I know Mistborn hasn't been adapted yet, but Brandon said a while ago that he's always regretted how Kelsier's crew was all male, and in an adaptation, he's considered swapping some of the genders. Now, an article Tor did furthered that and talked specifically about the characters they thought would be good for a gender swap. And while I was reading this article, I was like, yeah, Breeze, what a good idea. Ham, yeah, good idea, that would be interesting. And then they're like, but the one that makes the most sense to gender swap is Kelsier. And I was like, hold up, no. And obviously my negative reaction to that is because Kelsier is one of my favorite characters in the entire Cosmere, so I have a very specific way that I view him versus perhaps Ham or Breeze. While I like those characters, aren't as close to my heart. And so I immediately recognized that my knee-jerk negative reaction to that was because I love Kelsier and have viewed him in a very specific way. Now, if you followed my channel for a while, you know feminist issues in fantasy are very important to me, especially female representation, which can sometimes be underrepresented, especially in high fantasy adult spaces. So it's not that I'm obviously against more female representation, but I do think there is an understandable reaction when a favorite character is going to be changed in a significant way than how we viewed them. And this doesn't always have to do with gender. I think of why I dislike the fourth Harry Potter movie so much, because the view I had of Mad-Eye Moody was so vastly different than what they portrayed that I had this automatic negative reaction. So I don't think it's fair to automatically say people are sexist if they don't want their characters gender swapped. I think there is some more to the issue underneath that. Of course, gender usually isn't the reason we love a character. Now, if a character shares our gender, it might give us a closer connection to them, and I've definitely found myself relating to characters more frequently when they are female, but I'm not arguing that that's like the only thing about them, but I do think it's an element in how we have envisioned them. Which led me to the question, why are we gender swapping? And I truly think the reason is that we want more female representation, which I don't think is a bad goal. The reason I think that's the main goal of these gender swaps is that I don't think I've ever seen a property switch from a female character to male. Now, I know that happens a lot in fan fiction spaces, but those are generally to explore artistic merits or specific storylines, and as they aren't widely spread or considered canon in any way, I'm removing those from this conversation. The only other time I think I've ever seen that is if they swap both characters, so if there's like a male and female character and then they swap those, but otherwise it's pretty much exclusively male to female. Now, I can't fault this reasoning necessarily. Again, as someone who wants to see more female representation in adult fantasy, I understand the idea behind it. But it does beg this question, is there a difference between authentic female representation and just gender swapping? I actually read a great blog post by Joe Eberhardt titled Authentic Female Representation versus Gender Swap, and it's a great article. I highly recommend you reading it. I'll leave that link below, but I did want to quote some of the things that she said. Slapping a new name and gender identity on a pre-established character doesn't do a whole lot to correct the gender imbalance in films and TV. And as you may remember, I'm just a tiny bit passionate about the importance of female characters in fiction. But not only does gender swapping established male characters, especially male characters who exist specifically to highlight the dangers of unbridled competitive masculinity, not help the overall problem, it often makes it worse. Imagine, if you will, a world in which movie executives actually think female protagonists can be authentic characters in their own right, and not merely gender-swapped versions of popular male characters. She specifically talked about the all-female Ghostbusters, Ocean's 8, and the announced all-female Lord of the Flies, which is what she was talking about, highlighting masculinity in that quote. Something I thought was interesting that she talked about, and something I've noticed before, is usually these gender-swapped properties don't allow themselves to exist in the same universe as the original properties. So things like Ghostbusters, which may have been better if it was just a follow-up to the original Ghostbusters and not have to be rewritten with a female cast. And not just, oh, we're redoing it with a female cast. And I can't help agreeing with this in some ways. I wonder, why do we need a female James Bond instead of just creating a new spy character that could be beloved? Of course, some famous characters I think do lend themselves to gender swapping much more. For example, Doctor who gets regenerated every once in a while as a new actor. You start wondering, well, after 12 cycles of this, wouldn't it be nice to bring something fresh into the mix for a 13th Doctor and make her female? Or even Thor, where we're not replacing the character of Thor, but rather passing on a title. Those things seem to lend themselves better to moving in a new gender direction. Going back to my earlier point about James Bond, you might say, well, it's for brand recognition, but I always wonder if it maybe hurts it, because you're gonna immediately have this visceral reaction to changing it instead of just making a movie that's good on its own right. Sometimes I wonder if they're relying too much on name recognition instead of just bringing authentic new female characters forward. I'm not saying it can't be done well, but I'm just saying it's a weird line. And I do think there's maybe a reason why we're having this issue, and I want to pivot the conversation a little bit. I read an amazing book last year called Invisible Women: Data Bias in a World Built for Men by Perez, and a quote that was in the introduction of the book I think really gets to the heart of this issue. The result of this deeply male-dominated culture is that the male experience, the male perspective, has become to be seen as universal, while the female experience, that of half the global population after all, is seen as, well, niche. And I feel like this couldn't be more true in fantasy fiction. Growing up, I just noticed a lot that even in children's literature, fantasy books that were written with a male main character were seen as something that everyone could enjoy, while fantasy books with a female lead were seen as something only for women. A great example of this would be like Harry Potter versus Ella Enchanted. And in fact, there was this great Reddit post by someone that I saw and I saved because I've thought about this a lot, talking about all the posts on Reddit where a man will say, wow, I read Little Women and I couldn't believe how great it was and how much I actually related to it. And she pointed out that you never see a female going, oh my gosh, I read Catcher in the Rye or whatever male dominated, and I couldn't believe that I could actually relate to it because it was a male main character. We're just expected to relate. And I don't think that that's the problem. I think it's the problem that we think that men can't relate to female characters because they absolutely can. Okay, so I may have gotten off track here a little bit, but let me bring it back to what I'm saying. I sometimes think under the guise of more representation, there has been misguided attempts to bring legitimacy to female characters by making them a gender-swapped version of male characters. But really, we just need to start finding female characters universal in the way we find male characters universal and start just making more natural properties female. For example, if someone told me they were going to remake Lord of the Rings but an entire female fellowship, I'm not gonna lie, I'd have zero interest in it. I love the Lord of the Rings as it is, and I think it's perfectly fine that it's a male-centric story, oh well. If someone wants to do that, just make a new great story. Okay, it's hard to compare to Tolkien, I get it. But you know what I mean, right? Just make a new high fantasy story with a group of women who are going on a quest. There's nothing wrong with that. In conclusion, I'm still undecided about gender swapping. I think it's really a case-by-case basis for me. I think there are some cases where it works very well and some cases where I just really question why are we doing this and why is it needed. Now, it was interesting. I did ask my Instagram followers how they felt about the announcement of the 13th Doctor being a woman, and the results were really mixed. Although I will say a lot of people messaged me saying the reason they said they didn't like it is the execution of it. Apparently that season was written terribly. I haven't watched it. So I think that skewed it more to dislike. But it is interesting that it was kind of all over the place. People didn't know how they felt about it. And I think that's how I feel a lot of the times. And so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on gender swapping in the comments below. Do you always love it? Do you feel like me that maybe it's not always authentic? What TV shows or movies have you seen where gender swapping worked very well or very badly? Please let me know in the comments below. And of course, if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. Or you can follow me on Instagram at bookborn.reviews to see what I'm currently reading and other nerdy rants. I'll see you next time. Bye.